Hello, everyone. As you're coming in, please let us know where you're tuning in from. Um, we'd love to know where you are. Looks like we have about half the people here, half our audience. So yeah, let us know where you're tuning in from this evening. I'm not at the Mark Twain House, unfortunately. This is a virtual background, but I'm not far. I'm just a couple miles east of it in East Hartford. It looks like we have someone from Tolland, Connecticut, Madison, Connecticut, White Plains, New York. All places I've been to so far or passed by through. West Hartford, tuning in and cheering on my CCSU colleague Vivian, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, West Hartford. Pam says hi to Vivian and everyone there. Ann Arbor, Westport. So we're just waiting for a couple more people. But you know what? I'll just go ahead and get started and then we can go from there. Hi, I'm Omar Acevedo and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to host tonight's program for a few days full of trouble, revelations on the journey to justice for my cousin and best friend, Emmett Till. First, I need to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. As a nonprofit organization, the Mark Twain House and Museum depends on contributions to share our enriching author programs like A Few Days Full of Trouble, our education initiatives, and other events with our community. If you can, please consider donating. I'll provide a link for that in the chat, but you can also go to our website to check the donations. So this evening, we're welcoming Christopher Benson and Vivian Martin for a discussion of A Few Days Full of Trouble. Unfortunately, Reverend Parker Jr. could not join us this evening.
He is going to join you. Sorry, but he is coming.
Oh, okay. Great. So I will do his introduction as well. Our first author, Reverend Wheeler Parker Jr., is a pastor and district superintendent of the Argo Temple Church of God in Christ in Summit, Illinois, the church built by Alma Carthan, grandmother of Emmett Till. A sought-after public speaker, Reverend Parker lectures and teaches on the history of the struggle for equal justice in America. Our second author, Christopher Benson, is an Emmy Award-winning lawyer, journalist, and associate professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. He co-authored with the late Mamie Till-Mobley the Pulitzer Prize nominated Robert F. Kennedy Award-winning Death of Innocence. Formerly the Washington editor of Ebony, he has contributed to Chicago Magazine, Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times, and the New York Times. And our moderator, Vivian B. Martin, is a professor and chair of the journalism department at Central Connecticut State University. We hosted her and her mother, Ruth Martin, in the fall for their book, Beatrice's Ledger, Coming of Age in the Jim Crow South. And that was an in-person program, so unfortunately we don't have a recording of it. But please, Beatrice's Ledger is a wonderful book that you can also purchase. We encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. And finally, perhaps most importantly, I will not be putting a link in the chat to purchase the book. I went on the shop in our shop online shop, and it looked like it wasn't there. So I will put my email. So if you're interested in buying the book, just reach out to me, and I will make sure you get a copy. Buying it through us at the museum will support our museum and our honored guests as well. So that is all from me. I will turn this over to Reverend Parker and Christopher and Vivian.
Thank you. You're going to hear me say this a few times tonight, so that I won't sound obnoxious and that you'll understand why I'm doing it, and why I will say probably a few times buy this book, is that it was amazing. I thought I knew everything there was to know about the Emmett Till case. I would see movies, I'd see new things, and I'd be like, well, I know the story. I have taught it, the coverage of it from 55 in a journalism history class, and I thought I knew it, but this told me I did not know all of the twists and turns, and so that's why I'm going to keep saying, read this, and just to understand how the confluence of systemic racism, media distortions, and the entrepreneurial work of some literary grifters have really confounded how we think about this book. So thank you, Reverend Parker and Christopher Benson, for doing this work. I guess that's where I will start. One of the things that I think when we think about this case, there are those of us who would love to see somebody in handcuffs, right? We'd love to see the perp walk and all of that, but that's not happening. That's long ago beyond us. So justice here means something else. And one of the things that you say early on in the book is that the Reverend talks about wanting to clear Emmett Till's name, and that is one of his goals, because I assume that other people are just as ignorant of certain pieces of it as I was. So, Reverend, could you tell us what are the main things that you like people to know?
Thank you very much for having us, and I thank Chris for being here and the work that he has done. The Emmy Till story had so many twists and turns through the years. And the thing that resonates and stays with me is what happened at the very beginning. The way he was portrayed, it was portrayed in such a way that he deserved what he got. And I hated the way they portrayed him, and I still don't like it. So when Miss Bryant Tyson said that she had lied on Emmett, so I thought we were getting some justice there, or getting some consideration, but that didn't happen. So that's my main goal in life. A lot of good things come out of Emmett's death, but I always go back to how he suffered, and I ask if the pleasure worth the strain.
Thank you. What about you, Chris?
Well, I grew up with the story. There's nothing more compelling than that. And then I was able to meet Emmett Till's mother about 20 years ago, and that's when we worked on her book. It was a project that we took on during the last 6 months of her life. She introduced me to Wheeler Parker and sent me to him in order to fill in the gaps of her memory, and we hit it off. Began talking about the story. He set up a meeting with about 8 or 9 of Emmett Till's childhood friends and some cousins. And yeah, so we had a wonderful conversation there. I learned things about Emmett Till that even his mother didn't know, because these were the boys who hung out with him, right? And so Reverend Parker and I began doing presentations over the course of these past 20 years. And so it was a natural connection for us. After he decided he was going to write a book, that I would join him in that project. It started out as an ask for me to do the foreword, then to help edit. And when the last 4 years of the investigation got started, we joined forces to do the entire book, tracking the investigation and using that investigation to build the personal story as well. So it's, as you pointed out, quite a unique offering, in the sense that there are parallels here. There's the investigation, which drives the memory, and the memory, which informs the investigation. And so we think it's quite a compelling story on multiple levels, and I'm sure we'll get to that as well. So thank you for having this conversation with us, and thanks to the Mark Twain House for sponsoring this.
Reverend Parker, you're like one of the last witnesses, as I understand it, correct? You have a cousin who's alive, but you were the last witness who was there that night when the knock at the door at what, 2:30 in the morning. How do you live with something like that for so many, what, 67 years? Is it ever out of your mind?
No, it's never out of your mind. And I guess I dealt with a lot of hypotheticals. Maybe it didn't happen, but it did happen. You know, tried to make it not happen. Maybe just a nightmare, but it did happen. Then you ask yourself the question, how could that happen in the United States of America, the land of the free and the home of the brave? But it's always there. It's always, sometimes now I get caught up, and actually recently I was telling a story and tears came, you know, and you have different emotions at different times.
To write this book, you had to tap into a lot of those emotions. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Did you come back to it, put it down? And I'd also like to hear from your co-author, Chris, because he had to live with it too. Not in the same way, but
Yes.
it's pretty traumatic reading it. So I can imagine having to write it.
When you write it, there are a lot of emotions that you recapture, and you can't get away from it. You don't know when it's going to come, but next thing you know, you hit with it and you deal with it, and you stop and you get yourself together and you continue to write. You have a job to do, and you have a mission to fulfill. So you have to get back to, when you have a life, you have to get back to the life that's at hand.
Yeah, it is painful. There's no question about it. I experienced that when I worked on the first book, and I didn't realize that as I was cranking out chapters, because we didn't finish until after Mamie Till-Mobley had passed, that I was under such pressure that it didn't finally come out until our editor asked for the dedication. I hadn't thought about that. And checked with family members, and we agreed on how the dedication would be entered. And so as I was typing it out, dedicated to Emmett Lewis Till, I just broke down because all of this had been building up all the time. But I can share a story that I experienced with Reverend Parker as well. We were participating in the investigation. We had traveled down to Memphis to meet with the FBI, and had one briefing over dinner, had notes of the investigation. It was winding down at this point, but we were staying at the Central Station Hotel. Central Station was an active train station for so many years, big station in Memphis. And I kept commenting as we were walking through it, and we were joking about it. I said, you know, this used to be a real train station. It was a hotel at the time. And so Reverend Parker kept saying, Chris, it still is a train station. So that was our running joke. At one point, we were sitting in the lobby reading through our notes, wall of windows to our south. And I said, oh my gosh, this really is a train station. And there's a train. Then we realized that that was the City of New Orleans train. It was about 10 o'clock that night. The train that had taken Wheeler and Emmett down to Mississippi, the train that was taking Wheeler back home alone. And at that moment, he got up and walked over to the windows as if spellbound and just stared out at the train for the longest time, flashing back to all the painful memories of how they had made the trip together and how he had come back home without his cousin, his best friend. And that was a driving force as we were completing the book, to tap into that emotion, because that's what connects to people. I should say, yeah, there are the painful parts, but it's ultimately uplifting because of the way we draw everything together, and hopefully encourage other people to get involved.
Just a little aside on the train, what's really powerful also about the train story is that the family got Reverend Parker, I guess then 16 years old, correct? On the train the next day to get him back to Chicago for safety. And I was just really moved and impressed by how well they worked together to get that done, to get him out of town, because they knew what they had to do. And there are lots of moments like that in the book. You're talking about investigations, and I think for a lot of us, we didn't know about all of these other things, your ride-alongs with the FBI and other things that are going on. So since you are also a lawyer, Chris, maybe at some point it's good for you to explain to them, you could explain to the people in attendance what you are referring to, because there are a few investigations. We get disappointments. So maybe I could throw that to you to explain, maybe summarize the couple of investigations that you write about.
Okay, yeah, I can get us started on that, and then I'll boot it over to Wheeler to fill in his personal reaction to it. But in 2004, an investigation was launched. It took 2 years and generated about 8,000 pages of documents, and ultimately went to a grand jury in Mississippi. And the grand jury issued a no true bill, which is to say no indictment. That was an FBI investigation, even though there was no live cause of action under the federal laws, but the federal government was assisting the state of Mississippi to determine if there were any people who were still alive who could be charged in any way with the abduction and killing or cover-up of the lynching of Emmett Till. So that was the one part, but then it was reactivated in 2017 with the publication of a book that purported to carry a confession by Carolyn Bryant Donham, who was Carolyn Bryant at the time. The boys were there, the person who accused Emmett of all kinds of things. And so we were called to Mississippi to begin cooperating with the FBI, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney in Mississippi, and the District Attorney to try to find anything that could be revealed that either showed that Carolyn Bryant had lied and that she could be charged with something, or that there was somebody else who would be revealed, since now it seemed that she was confessing. So that's how it started. There's more to say about that, but I want to boot it over to Wheeler, because he had a personal reaction once all the news broke, and I'm sure people saw the headlines about this woman who recanted. She said that part wasn't true, what she had lied about before. But Wheeler, maybe you have something to say about your reaction when you first heard about that.
And when I first heard, it was kind of like an answer to prayers, like my desires are being answered. Finally, Emmett Till is getting some justice in that she agreed that she lied on him, and he was not portrayed as this monster that he had made out to be. And of course, I was elated with that. Even when we couldn't find any evidence, I want to think, well, maybe she still lied, you know, and I still deal with that sometimes. But to think the way things went, and to think also how that our country handles such racism, it's not going anywhere. And I saw it again in Floyd's case and many other cases, and we've come a long ways and we've grown, but we got a lot of work still to do.
Let's go back to the recanting, or so the historian writes this book. Tim Tyson claims that she says that it didn't happen. She takes that back at a certain point, and it's not on the tape. Apparently, he either was working on his tape and putting it in, or something happened, and so it's not there, which of course throws, I'm sure that was really disappointing. But then we also learned he doesn't even have it in his notes. He does not take very good notes, and he did say that he did not see that as a big deal, because he's a historian. He wasn't trying to do tabloid journalism. And yet, of course, as we know, he leads with that story at the beginning of his book. So it must have been important somewhat. So what do you think now? Do you think she said it? Do you think he misheard? Do you think he's just a grifter?
I think, I like to think, of course, that she said it.
Okay.
That would help me, and it's mind-boggling for him to take a chance to say something like that with his reputation. You wonder, it's not investigated, it's not searched out, but you wonder, he took a great chance to even say that if it wasn't true. So you don't know where you're at with that. You don't know what the truth is probably. But he took an awful chance with his
Yeah,
reputation.
he did.
I don't know if it hurt him or not, but it was an awful chance to take.
Mhm.
Well, as you know, Vivian, you read the book, so you know that, I mean, it becomes sort of a page turner, right? A suspenseful book as we go through day by day with the FBI
Mhm.
and look over documents. We saw the manuscript of a book that she was writing, in which she actually comes back to the accusation and states it in even stronger terms, exaggerating so many things.
Right.
And Timothy Tyson, you're kind to call him an historian. He's more an
Right.
aggregator, because the only original story he had in the book was this alleged recantation or confession
Mhm.
that he couldn't prove even happened. But in the book, in the manuscript, you can see his fingerprints. He's helping to edit the book, so he saw that she had not changed her position. We see it there with the track changes that have his initials and the dates of every comment he made on the book. So he knew that she hadn't, yet he wrote that she had said those things. The FBI ultimately could not find any credible evidence, and that's what's in the final report. So yeah, we were disappointed because we thought this would be the conclusion of that part of the story. There can be no justice, obviously, in the horrible lynching of this 14-year-old kid. Justice would have meant that he had come home alive and intact, right?
Right.
But at least we hope for some accountability.
Mhm.
And now it seems that unless she comes forward and confesses finally
Mhm.
and convincingly, that there won't be any accountability from her.
It's Tyson is one of a number of people who seem to have latched onto the story, made a film, wrote a book, without a lot of primary sourcing. I mean, firsthand knowledge. I mean, they didn't even have to interview Reverend Parker or others around. I don't want to say how that happened, because we know how that happens, but usually for certain types of books, you need to be able to show all sorts of connections that would make it feasible for a publisher to publish you. And yet it seems like there are people who show up often to have a piece of the Emmett Till story. What happens with the next generation? I mean, Reverend Parker has some younger relatives who seem to have different ideas about how to portray it. Are we ever going to have a clear path to the Emmett Till story?
Only Miss Bryant can give us a clear path. I think her and Tyson, they hold the not the balance of power, but they hold the story. They hold the story. They can clear up a lot, and it's not beyond happening. That she could come back and say, "Yes, I did." Sometime when you're trying to get your be in good standing with God, you come back and you clear the air, by telling the truth, telling exactly what happened. And it's not beyond happening.
Sure.
Well, of course, Reverend Parker is a minister, he's a pastor, so he's guided by faith.
Right.
And
Yeah.
as we know, we've lived for generations on faith, a belief in the unseen, right? Like justice.
Right. Exactly.
So we don't know, but yeah, we can still be hopeful. We can still be faithful that somehow something's going to happen. But yeah, it's really insulting that Timothy Tyson never saw fit to contact Reverend Parker and talk to him. And I don't know how you feel about that, Rev.
Yes, it's clear. I mean, it kind of speaks for itself. How can you write a book and don't contact the people who are directly involved? And then he may end up like the other said, "I alleged," and that's more insulting.
No, that's
I got that after I told my story after 30 years. I tell them, I said, as Black people in America, we're not privileged. You know, we're not given the benefit of the doubt as an eyewitness, you know.
right. That's all, just an eyewitness, right? Your narrative, there's lots of information here, and it would be interesting to see how the two of you hear about how the two of you worked. I mean, were there areas where perhaps the Reverend thought he needed more of that and you said no? There's a section where you go into Emmett Till's father and what happened to him in World War II. He was hanged for accusations of raping 2 women and killing one that in Italy. And at the time that it came out, of course, it's believed to have had an impact on a jury's decision to not go back and indict the 2 for kidnapping, Bryant and his brother, half brother. But I guess it was like it should never have had that kind of impact and gotten that kind of information. It shouldn't have been out there in the way it was. It was kind of like implied father rapist, son, moving in that direction. So did you talk about how much of these types of things to put in, whether they were tangential or whether you had to go at it?
Well,
Chris,
we had kind of a 2 rooms arrangement. We met often and talked and had conversations. That's how I like to do interviews. They're more like conversations. But we have to give credit also to Reverend Parker's spouse, Dr. Marvell Parker, who actually was urging him to write the book and encouraged me to work with him, but also reviewed everything as we were going through it. So we met often. But in the writing process, we do a to and fro by email and talk about some of the things that we were uncovering. But with respect to Emmett Till's father, Louis Till, we started that story with Mamie Till-Mobley's book, because, as you say, the court-martial of Louis Till and the execution of Emmett Till was discussed in that book, but it came out in 1955 between the murder trial, during which these 2 killers were acquitted by an all-white, all-male jury, and the kidnapping grand jury. They admitted that they had kidnapped Emmett Till, so that was like an open and shut case. But the power structure in Mississippi released the court-martial record, which is confidential at that time. And so, as you say, people just said, well, like father, like son. Obviously, if the father was bad, then the son was. But that was the original story that I had gotten from Mamie Till-Mobley and also from her brother-in-law, who had served in Europe and told stories about how Black enlisted men were called out in the middle of the night and accused of having these relations with white women, and they were often consensual relations, but they were charged with rape and court-martialed.
Right.
So we began to believe that might have happened with Louis Till, but I'm going to let Reverend Parker pick it up from there because he had more information about that we were able to talk through and include in the book. You remember the conversation with Lamorris?
Yes, the man whom Mamie married after the war there, he said that he told the story as to what happened. He said that Emmett's father and the lieutenant both was going with the same woman.
The white lieutenant.
Yeah, white lieutenant, yeah, with that. And when you read the transcript of the trial, I mean, to see the way it played out, having been in the military, and they take people who are in the military and use them as lawyers. They're not lawyers, but the guy didn't have a chance. He never had a chance. And when he went to court, he wouldn't even talk. He was so far behind the 8th ball, so caught up in a system that he had no chance to win. And you have to read it to kind of get a better idea of how it played out. in 1940 something, as Chris say, in the war, and blacks over there fraternizing with white women, you can just about imagine. You know what it was like in the South. Yeah, he didn't have a chance at the trial.
The commanding officers and NCOs were white Southerners, because it was believed that white Southerners knew how to handle the so-called Negro troops. And so they were determined that the soldiers were not going to come back to the States with those kinds of attitudes, that they were free to date white women. And the statistics, there's been research on this that shows that of the number of GIs who were brought up on charges, the great percentage were African Americans. And it's really horrible to read some of these stories about how they treated Black troops, and how white soldiers were almost encouraged to have these kind of relationships with the women there. And I don't want to characterize it, but they were let off on those.
Sure. I appreciate.
So it might be true that
Yeah.
like father, like son, maybe they both were lynched.
Well, I appreciate your reference to Mary Lou Roberts' book, What
Yeah.
Soldiers Do. And it does talk a lot about that. It's just amazing, all the things we learn in terms of race, what things that were going on. I mean, soldiers were basically raping their way through Europe, and they often court-martialed or hanged black soldiers, even if there were eyewitnesses, even if the women didn't identify them. So what I just found so amazing was how the Emmett Till story intersect with, all of this other history, race history, and other things about, our culture. So I thought that was put together really well.
But of course, Wheeler has the story from an eyewitness who was over there.
Right.
The person who ultimately married Mamie, and had a conversation with him. What did Lamore say that Lewis had told him to go back and make
Go back
sure?
and take care of his wife.
I guess he did.
He married her. He was one of our favorite of her husbands. First one we really knew. She had a couple. Well, I don't get into that. Anyway. He was a guy that we really liked, and no offense to the others, but we really liked the one that came back and married him.
So
her mother did too. Her mother called him Sergeant Malder with great respect.
I appreciated that. Were there concerns about how you were portraying Emmett Till? Because as you know, people often would say to you, people often say he brought it on himself. And you talk about that, and you have a cute line in there where you say that, his mother knew how he played, but you knew how he played her, that he was mischievous, he was rambunctious. You talk about him running up and down the train on the way down. And so we do get to see him. Were you concerned that as you try to tell the story, because a lot of people can't reason, so they, you bring in a narrative with a real human, particularly when we go around civil rights issues, and people seem less empathetic. Were you concerned about how he was portrayed, how the whistle story is portrayed? Because in some people's minds, there's a big difference between a whistle versus a wolf whistle. Or did you have conversations about that?
Myself, I was always concerned about how can you justify taking the law into your own hands just for a whistle,
Right.
We lived in America in 1955, and a lot of blacks lost their life for even a reckless eyeball, So that kind of spread, and I was at my school, and one of the students said, "Why are we talking about Emmy Till? He misbehaved." Yeah, but they took the law into their own hand. Do we have a chance? Are we allowed to have due process? It seemed like we throw that out. He violated Southern Murray, and he did violate the Southern Murray. Was that worthy of death without having due process? And that's what I always go back to. It seems like America said, no, he violated and he got what he deserved. That's the only way you can put that. And that's so so stupid, it's so ignorant, you know, to even think that way. But when you look at America and the way we have processed and where we have moved through time, you can understand why some people felt that way.
Well, I have taught it and had students in the class point out, because we read it in journalism history, we read about the coverage. And I've had students say, well, when they hear about the whistle, they will say, well, he brought it on himself. I mean, that shouldn't have happened to him, but he brought it on himself. And I guess when I think about the Emmett Till story and how it's told, I wonder what happens, as we get more and more, as we get farther away from that time. I mean, when men whistled, they did things like that. They catcalled across, but today, that's considered very aggressive. I mean, even and still no excuse for what happened, but I wonder about how other generations will hear that, because in the Me Too era, to even whistle at a woman will get you down to HR, human resources are. I mean, so as that story gets told, I wonder about other generations.
Well, one of the things we tried to do, and this is why this is such a unique story, because Reverend Parker knew Emmett Till so well. I mean, it's hard even to describe how close they were. He says at various points that, they were like brothers. I mean, he was like Wheeler's like his big brother, but he was a prankster. Yeah. And the center of attention. I let him tell you about that, but he always wanted to make people laugh. And so in his mind, it wasn't a sexist act, as some, feminist writers, scholars have tried to portray it. Yes, it's not something that you would accept. It's offensive, but at that moment, he's thinking he's going to make everybody laugh.
Right.
And in that second, that split second, he doesn't realize what an offensive thing that is until they react. And maybe you could fill in the rest of the story, Wheeler.
Yeah,
About
well,
the story. Yeah.
He had no idea about the South. He had no idea about the double standard. He was too young, so he didn't think in terms. I would have never done it because I was well indoctrinated. I spent my first 7-8 years in the South, so that would never happen to me. But he had no way of knowing what he was dealing with, who he's dealing with, and the rules, the do's and the don'ts about the South. All those mothers said she gave him a crash course, but you can't take a crash course and go to Mississippi, 1955. So he had no idea what he was dealing with, none whatsoever.
There's just so much here. It's so rich, and people, you have to read it. I was trying to think about when did I learn about Emmett Till, and I don't think I learned about it in school. I mean, it happened, before I was born, so I don't have the kind of memory that you have, Chris, or so we all come to it differently too. One of my colleagues, Susan Gilmore, I just see she posted in the chat that she came to it through Gwendolyn Brooks' work, and so there are, the literature, there are ways that people come through it, but it's not as commonly. It wasn't as commonly taught for those of us coming of age in high school in the 70s. Let's see, but I would like to start bringing other people into the conversation. So I would like to just acknowledge what my colleague did say. She teaches American literature and does deal with that experience and others in her classes. So Omar could help me here because we have about we have a little less than 20 minutes, and I really would like to bring others in.
Sure.
So
would you like me to just read Susan's comments?
Yes, you could read that. You can.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So Susan Gilmore says, I share excerpts of the American Experience documentary on Emmett Till with my American literature college students when we read Gwendolyn Brooks's poetry on this case. So one, I want to thank the Reverend for his moving commentary in the film. And two, I am wondering if he knows the poem, what the Reverend thinks of Brooks's poems, A Bronzeville Mother Loiters in Mississippi, and the last quatrain of the Ballad of Emmett Till, which depict Emmett's mother's strength, but also imagine Carolyn Bryant having a burst of guilt in connection to Till's mother that turns her against her murderer husband. It's a fantasy, but Brooks's poems were my introduction to the Till story. We didn't learn about it back in the late 70s, early 80s when I was in high school. And she also says, another point that gets lost in Bryant's accusations is that nothing, she says, Till did warrants his murder or any criminal punishment, let alone a death sentence. So I guess the question in there was if you were familiar with those poems, Reverend Walker.
Chris, maybe I'm not.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, I am, and I had the good fortune of meeting Gwendolyn Brooks while she was still around. My first book was a novel that was published by Third World Press, her publisher as well. So I had the good fortune of meeting her. But yeah, I mean, I think what that work, those works reflect is our deep desire to rewrite the story, right? And to not craft a happy ending, but an ending that might seem to us like justice. To have Carolyn Bryant turn on her husband is one thing. We all kind of expected at some point she was going to do exactly what Tim Tyson suggested she did do and couldn't prove it at the end. I should say as a footnote, well, the other part of it is, yeah, I think Reverend Parker already spoke to the, obviously the horrible injustice that was done and lack of any kind of, due process for accusing somebody, trying somebody if they did something of an offense, but this is not a capital offense. So we're all clear on that part. Nothing he did as a kid, as a prank, justified what was done to him. But we do painstakingly track the circumstantial evidence to place Carolyn Bryant in the truck when Emmett is kidnapped. And so you'd have to read it because we track all the evidence that was produced in the 2004-2006 investigation and everything we were able to put together in reading her manuscript years before it was released, actually, and interview transcripts that Tyson had with her and her daughter-in-law, and things that happened during the course of those events that we were able to piece together to say, hey, look, circumstantially, we have reason to believe she was there. Unfortunately, our belief doesn't amount to evidence. But if you read it, you'll probably be convinced as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we love Gwendolyn Brooks's work. I also, in my work in Ebony, was able to interact with journalists who had actually covered the trial. So that part of it informs our work as well.
So it's a Emmett Till in art and literature is very interesting, because there are paintings, there are controversy over the paintings, and it's in vogue. People make analogous things that aren't really analogous. I was reading Camille Cosby thinks her husband was treated in that way, and it's like, how do people make those connections? But it just shows you how deep this is in the culture.
Well, there is that element of the commodification of Emmett Till.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, everybody wants to profit in some way, either by boosting their stature, their profile, or making money in some way. And I'm not going to accuse Tyson of doing that, but I have to say that the only interview he has in there, he has many interviews cited, but I went through them and they're all archival sources. Okay. The only person it looks like he talked to was Carolyn Bryant.
Right.
And
Well-
why he didn't talk to the family is just astounding to us. He said he didn't need to because they have been quoted over the years, but
Badly.
they were misquoted, or
Right.
in Wheeler's case, as he writes in the book, people didn't even talk to him for about 30 years, yet they were using his name. So, I don't mean to talk about you like you're not in the room, Wheeler.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
What I find really useful about your book is it's almost like an annotation of critical annotations of the bad stuff that's out there, the warning labels that are needed. I think there's another author that you mentioned, was it Anderson or from Utah?
Oh, yeah.
Right,
Devery.
right, from Utah,
He's
right,
talking about
right.
Devery.
Exactly, exactly. And so, you know, as I'm reading through it, I'm saying, wow, there's so much out there that needs warning labels, not just the misinformation or the deliberate stuff, you know, just, you know, somebody, you know, big journalists who might have an inaccuracy that gets picked up over and over. And so from a standpoint of, you know, the disinformation, the misinformation, it's such an important case study as well, because you know, now of course I have to confess, I didn't have Tyson's book on my shelf, but after reading you sold a book for him, because I got out, I read, you know, I went through that because I was horrified by what I read in your book. And
Well, maybe that's all you needed.
right, well, that's it.
He's a
But
good
yeah.
writer, we can say that. But yeah, but then there's the original story that was written in Look magazine, and maybe
Yeah,
Reverend Parker
yeah,
wants to tell you what he thinks about that one, because that got into the echo chamber. Everybody just
Right.
kept citing that
Exactly.
original book. But how you feel about that one, Rev? William Bradford Huey?
I just couldn't believe it. I felt so helpless, and I questioned journalism. I questioned everything I read in newspaper. Always, you know, what is truth, and how can you, as a professional, say things or do things like that? And I
Sure.
remember my wife, a journalist wrote something about my wife, and he left town. She hounded him till she got him to retract it. And not too many people you see retractions every now and then, but
Mhm.
it just make you think. And I came up so innocent, I didn't think adults told lies.
Okay.
I thought only children told lies, keep from getting whipped.
Okay.
So I had a lot of faith in adults, especially when the newspaper, they're real professionals.
Mhm.
They can't
Yeah.
lie. I
Well,
learned
now you
George
know.
Washington can cut down the cherry tree.
Right. So one thing that I like to say some things about, or have you say some things about, is the notion of justice, because that's at the heart also of this book. We're talking about because we can't have the justice that we really want, which would have been him to be back on the train to Chicago. We can't get the legal justice. The criminal system is not set up the way laws are written, and so you have to find a separate piece of your justice as you define it. Could you talk a little bit about that? Since you're also a man of the cloth, maybe yours is much more elevated than ours, those of us who just still want to see somebody in handcuffs. But what does justice for Emmett Till mean for you?
I tell you for sure, and this is what his mother said, and this is what was said at the funeral. God said, vengeance is mine. We travel and we live with it all of our life. Everybody reap what they sow. Everybody. So that's something that's satisfying with us. And his mother said, in the end, it's like they don't exist. Everybody have their day in court. Everybody. So we believe that and we accept it. I think most people want to see something tangible, see someone really suffer, and you have to be careful with that too. You have to be careful how you feel about that. And I think Mamie and I felt the same way, that it's like they don't exist. We take a lemon and we make lemonade with it. We move on, and everybody has to have their day in court again. And everybody reap what they sow. Now,
One outcome, because early on, Chris had mentioned, there have been some good things to come out of this. And one of them is the Emmett Till Act. Could you talk a little bit about that? It's amazing how that got done. And is it Alvin Sykes who helped get, I mean, it's just that story and how that came together. But could you just explain the act, the legislation?
Well,
Chris, I thank you.
okay, there are two laws, and Alvin Sykes was an incredible person. He passed away a couple of years ago, and but he was a self-trained legal expert. He was a high school dropout who hung out at the library and taught himself the law. He's the person who really got the 2004 investigation started. He convinced the FBI that they had a legal justification for getting into it. He had researched and found some ancient memo that Antonin Scalia had written that provided the justification to investigate the JFK assassination. Believe it or not, when President Kennedy was assassinated, there was no law against assassinating a president. So the federal government didn't have jurisdiction. Alvin Sykes found that and used that to open the case for Emmett Till. And then he built on that to convince Republicans and Democrats in Congress, in the Senate and in the House, to pass the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act, which authorizes the FBI to investigate all the unsolved crimes that came up during the civil rights era. Then he got it renewed, and it doesn't have a sunset now, so it's going to be in existence forever. So that law, named after Emmett Till, allows the government, the federal government, to go in and investigate all the crimes that were not solved out of the civil rights movement, and then laid the groundwork for what Wheeler Parker and Dr. Parker experienced, the signing of the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act at the White House in this administration. And so if there is any justice that comes out of this, it's that people now who are going to be charged under these laws are going to be held to account, right? Nobody answered for Emmett, but now they're going to have to answer to Emmett.
That's well said. I think a strong point to end with. We have 5 more minutes, but I'm looking at the chat and we're looking for more questions. But as I said, people, you really have to read this, and you just we have so much information in our time, and yet you can still have like a poverty of information. You still can be uninformed and not know enough about
I
something like
can
this.
say something else on the positive side. You know, we've you know, we can continue trying to find somebody to indict for Emmett Till's lynching. We certainly would love to see something like that happen, because the signal it sends to the country that doesn't matter how long you live, that if you do something as horrible as this, you will be held to account for it eventually. That's on one side, but we've also been building in a positive way different programs, and we've started the Emmett Till and Mamie Till-Mobley Institute that is developing a curriculum, a national high school curriculum with Facing History and Ourselves, the specialist on diversity education in the public schools. And that'll be launched later this month, which is a 6-class unit that will help students understand not only the core story of Emmett Till, but also the need for them to become engaged in this democratic society. And this is important because, as you said, you didn't study Emmett Till. I didn't study Emmett Till. It wasn't offered in school. But now we're going to have people talking about this case at a time when there is a movement in this country to erase our history and to rewrite history in some ways, you know, just to start all over again and act like nothing ever happened. And at a time when people are trying to erase us and our identity, it's important for us to take a stand and tell the story and make sure that the story lives so that we can show that our lives mattered. And I think that's vitally important for students who are developing their own self-concept. So that's one of the many things we're doing. We're doing so many things. Dr. Parker is working on restoring Robert's Temple, where Emmett was funeralized. We have conversations about national monuments and that sort of thing. So we have a lot of programs that will continue to carry this story forward.
And you wrote this book, and as I keep saying it's just, yeah, it's really important. It's, well, the two of you, yeah, it's just so important. I mean, thank you to Dr. Dr. Marvell as well, because I'm reading the book. She's an important influence, I can tell. But thank you, Reverend Parker, for living with this. I mean, you could have, I guess, gone on. I mean, the world would have been different. The story out there would have been different. Thank you for taking this up as well, Chris. This is, it's important work. Thank you.
Well, thank you for taking it up. And as we said, thank you to the Mark Twain House for sharing this with the readers all over the country, I saw. So, hey, everybody. Good to get together. And thank you for taking such an interest in reading it. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing this story. It's been a wonderful program, very thought-provoking. So I'll just close out by saying thank you to our audience as well. Thanks for joining us. You can join us for future programs. On April 4th, you can join us in person or online for Dispatches from Puerto Nowhere, a story about a Puerto Rican family's efforts to assimilate that led to the near complete erasure of their heritage, culture, and language within 2 generations. And on April 25th, you can join us in person or online for The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho, a fictionalized account of the famous Briton who was born enslaved and became a famous writer, composer, and abolitionist, and even became the first Black person to vote in Britain. So that is all for this evening. Please join us again and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.